Hi, I'm Dan, and this is a video about long-lost buildings in a section of the old East Side of Hartford, Connecticut. Specifically, I'll be talking about 6 buildings that used to be on or around Market Street before the urban renewal of the 1960s. I'll start the video with a building that was just east of Market Street on the south side of Talcott Street, St. Anthony's Roman Catholic Church. Then I'll move on to buildings on the north side of Talcott Street. Firstly, the Brown School, which began as Hartford's oldest public grammar school and included numerous annexes built over the years. Then I'll talk about the Talcott Street Congregational Church, which was the home of Hartford's oldest African American congregation. Moving to Market Street, north of Morgan Street, I'll mention the Hartford factory of Manchester's Cheney brothers silk manufacturers, followed by Ados Israel Synagogue, and lastly, the Union Settlement. By the way, I've indexed this video with timestamps for each of these 6 places, so you can more easily find a specific subject. Let's get started. This is a section of the 1877 bird's eye view of Hartford. The old State House is in the upper left corner. Northeast of it was the old City Hall on Market Street. As I mentioned in another video, this was later the site of the city's police headquarters, and then became a parking lot for Sage Allen Department Store. Zooming in, I'll be talking about the section of Market Street north of Talcott Street, but I'll start on the south side of Talcott. Here's a picture of the area today showing a view from Columbus Boulevard, the former Front Street, westward up Talcott Street towards Market Street. On the left is the north edge of Constitution Plaza. Back in 1958, this block was the location of St. Anthony's Roman Catholic Church. Since 1898, the parish had been using the 1855 church building at 125 Market Street. The cornerstone of the new Talcott Street Church's basement chapel was laid in 1921. The church was badly damaged in the floods of 1936 and 1938. Later, in the mid-1950s, when plans were being made for redevelopment, there were protracted negotiations over the sale of various properties owned by the parish, including land where the parish's library, rectory, and convent were located. At that point, it was still intended that the church itself would remain in place, but in 1957 it was announced that St. Anthony's would merge with St. Patrick's Church on Church Street, meaning that the Talcott Street Church would be sold for redevelopment. Returning to the 1877 view, just north across Talcott Street, from where St. Anthony's Church would be built, was the Brown School, erected in 1868. This circa 1870 photograph is a view to the northeast, taken from the old State House towards the Connecticut River in the distance. The 4-story Brown School was the tallest building in the vicinity. It was built for the city's first school district, which had its origins in Hartford's oldest public school that was first supported by the colonists in 1643. Before the construction of the Brown School, the first district had used what was called the Old Stone Schoolhouse, nicknamed the Stone Jug, which was built in 1816 and stood on Market Street just beyond the right edge of what this photo shows. The stone building was added to over the years as the population of the school district grew. A much larger building was eventually needed, and in 1866 construction began on the new 4-story building, which was completed in 1868. Designed by George H. Gilbert, the school was built of Boston-faced brick with Portland brownstone trim. The The school was named after Flavius A. Brown, who for 43 years was the chairman of the first school district committee and had overseen the building's construction. A former writing instructor, Brown, who died in 1880, had become a prominent Hartford businessman and was a senior partner in the book-selling company Brown and Gross, located on Asylum Street. There were 6 classrooms on each of the building's first 3 floors, while the 4th floor contained an assembly hall. Water closets were located behind the building, reached by a covered walk that divided the boys' and girls' playgrounds. As the immigrant population of Hartford's East Side continued to grow, additional space was needed. In 1897, the Brown School Annex was erected, just north of the original Brown School building. Designed by Hartford architect William C. Brocklesby, the new building contained 10 classrooms, a sewing room, a cooking room, administrative offices, and a library. In the basement, there was a woodworking room and a laboratory. This postcard view shows the Brown School and the annex. Located just to the east was a building opened in 1889 as the school's kindergarten, which accommodated 200 students. It was the first public school kindergarten building built in Connecticut. On June 16, 1914, the Hartford Courant reported that, quote, the report of Principal Charles L. Ames showed that 2,455 children were enumerated in the district during the year between the ages of 4 and 16 years, and the average attendance to June 1st was 1,591.7, an increase of 53.8 over last year. There were 480 children transferred to other schools or to work, and 533 were received in the school. Principal Ames spoke of a census taken last December which showed that the proportion of children of foreign parentage was as follows: Italian 1,100, Russian, Austrian, and Polish 500, German 50, Irish 25, Swedish 12, French 12, all others 25. Only 1 pupil has a parent in a foreign country, and 3 have both. There were 350 children who entered last December who were unable to speak a word of English, 100 of whom had attended school in Europe. Of these, the majority were able to be transferred from the foreign department after only a few weeks' tuition, and were placed in the regular grades, many of them skipping a grade at the next promotion. Principal Ames also spoke of the growth of the Brown School and said with pride that the class of 1914, which graduates this week, numbers 67, which is the largest in the history of the institution, unquote. By 1914, the need for more space had again become critical, and plans were made to build yet another annex on the site of the old kindergarten building. The start of construction was delayed because of World War I, but the new building, designed by Isaac A. Allen, Jr., was finally opened in 1923. This circa 1930 photograph of Hartford shows the original Brown School building and the 1897 annex. Just to the east is the 1923 building, which was named the Cone Annex in honor of William E. Cone, a Civil War veteran and prominent businessman who was the chairman of the district's building committee. The 3-story Gothic building's exterior consisted of rough textured light cream-colored brick with limestone trim. This is a 1906 photo by William H. Thompson. It's a view south down Market Street, across Morgan Street, with the Brown School Annex on the left and the original Brown School behind it. That original building of 1868 was demolished in 1946, but the 1897 and 1923 buildings continued in use. until the Brown School finally closed its doors in 1951 and its students were transferred to the Barnard School on Main Street. The student body, which once included the future stars of the stage Otis Skinner and Sophie Tucker, had shrunk from 1,600 in 1923 to 470 in its final year of 1951. The 1897 annex was torn down in 1952, while the 1923 Cone Annex was repurposed to become the city's new police headquarters. When this photograph was taken, circa 1953, work had begun on the site of the old Brown School buildings of 1868 and 1897 to build a parking garage for G. Fox department store. By the time of this photograph, the garage had been completed, and an addition had also been constructed on the Cone Annex, which in 1955 officially became the new police headquarters and city court building. The police HQ moved to a new building on Jennings Road in 1979. In 2001, the former police HQ, called the Morgan Street Jail, and the old parking garage were replaced by the new Morgan Street Garage that occupies the site today. Returning to the earlier view, there was a church on the northwest corner of Market and Talcott Streets. This was the Talcott Street Congregational Church, which was home to Hartford's oldest African-American congregation. The church building in this photo was erected in 1906, but the original church on the site was built 80 years earlier, in 1826. The congregation's origins went back to 1819, when a group of African Americans who were tired of segregated seating in the rear sections of the city's churches at the time began worshiping in their own group in the conference room of Center Church on Main Street. The following year they established the African Religious Society, which had a Sunday school and held worship services in a building at the foot of State Street. In 1826, the society erected their new church at the corner of Talcott and Market Streets. The church was a social and educational center for the city's black community. In the basement was Hartford's first school for black children. In 1831 and 1835, white mobs attacked the church. The church persevered and also became a center of abolitionist activity. One of its early pastors, in the 1840s and 50s, was the Reverend James W.C. Pennington, who at the age of 19 escaped from slavery in Maryland to become an abolitionist orator and writer. Pennington was in Scotland when the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 was passed. Fearful of returning to the United States, he remained abroad until the Hartford lawyer and abolitionist John Hooker, brother-in-law of Harriet Beecher Stowe, successfully purchased Pennington's freedom in 1851. The church was known by several names during its early years, but in 1860 it became the Talcott Street Congregational Church. In the 1890s, the congregation began planning to erect a new church building. Designed by George H. Gilbert, who had also designed the original Brown School, the church was erected in 1906. As the Hartford Courant reported on April 9, 1906, quote, "Interior and exterior will be of the best materials and of simple and durable construction, rather than ornamental, the people desiring to have an attractive church and Sunday school, but realizing the need of using their limited means toward making a substantial building, considering first its utility and adaptability to the work. The members consider the building somewhat in the light of a monument in commemoration of the noble and heroic souls who in the days of trial gallantly espoused the cause of the weak and the oppressed. Also as a reminder in this and succeeding generations of the patriotism believed and taught in it and exemplified by the 32 men who went forth from the congregation to the war for the Union." Unquote. The 1906 church remained the congregation's home for nearly a half-century. In 1953, the Talcott Street Congregational Church merged with Mother Bethel Methodist Church to form Faith Congregational Church. The following year, the congregation moved to the former Windsor Avenue Congregational Church on Main Street, which is still its home today. The old church was demolished for a parking lot for G. Fox department store. This is the area today. This is a photograph of the scene of a traffic accident on Market Street in 1923. The Talcott Street Congregational Church is on the left, and the 1897 annex of the Brown School is on the right. Here's the same area during the flood of 1936. This is a Thompson photo from 1906. It's a view north up Market Street from Talcott Street. And here is the same area during the flood of 1936. In the distance are the next two buildings I'll be talking about, the Cheney Silk Factory and Ados Israel Synagogue. The Cheney Brothers Silk Manufacturing Company was the nation's leading manufacturer of silk textiles. The company was based in South Manchester, Connecticut, where its origins go back to the 1830s. It eventually built a massive complex of silk mills and an associated mill village, which included housing and amenities for workers. In 1876, the company erected an office building designed by H. H. Richardson on Main Street in Hartford. Known as the Cheney Building, or today the Richardson Building, it was long the home of Brown Thompson Department Store. Over 2 decades before it was built, in 1854, the company had erected a U-shaped mill at the corner of Market and Morgan Streets, depicted here in the 1877 bird's eye view of Hartford. As the Hartford Courant described the building on January 28, 1907, quote, "The Morgan Street Mill was erected in 1854 owing to the scarcity of tenements in Manchester at that time. When Cheney Brothers needed more help, they also had to build the houses in which their employees were to live. At that time, they did not have the capital to do the amount of home building that would be necessary, so they decided to build in Hartford, where help and tenements were more easily obtainable." Unquote. The Hartford Courant explained on July 13, 1888, that the mill, quote, "employs about 300 hands, chiefly girls and young women, from 14 years upward. In 2 large rooms is conducted the work of winding, doubling, and spinning the raw silk, received in skeins from France, China, and Japan." Unquote. The silk was then sent to the Manchester mills to be dyed, but many of those dyed skeins would return to Hartford to be woven into silk ribbons. 5 large rooms of the Hartford mill were devoted to manufacturing ribbons. This is a Thompson view east down Morgan Street with the Cheney Mill on the left and the corner of the roof of the Brown School Annex on the right. This is a Thompson view west up Morgan Street with the rear of the Cheney Mill's south wing on the right. In 1907, Cheney Brothers sold the building to the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad Company. The Cheneys built a new mill in Manchester to continue the work that had been done in the Morgan Street Mill. The Hartford building continued to exist for the next half-century, used for various purposes until it was taken down to make way for highway construction. This photo is a view north up Market Street during the flood of 1938. The former Cheney Mill building is on the right. Further north is Ados Israel Synagogue. Dedicated in 1899, the synagogue was the home of Hartford's oldest Orthodox congregation until the building was sold in 1962 to the Hartford Redevelopment Agency. It was demolished the following year. The architect of the synagogue was Irish immigrant Michael O'Donoghue, who also designed many Catholic churches. Ados Israel has been described by David F. Ransom as the second architecturally significant synagogue to be built in Hartford. The first was Temple Beth Israel, erected in 1876 on Charter Oak Avenue and designed by George Keller, architect of the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Arch. The design of both of these Hartford synagogues was part of a tradition exemplified by the new synagogue on Orienberger Strasse in Berlin, construction of which began in 1859. That building featured a recessed central section flanked by projecting corner towers with Moorish or Byzantine-style domes. Its design also influenced that of Temple Emmanuel in New York City, built in 1868, as well as many other urban synagogues in American cities, including Hartford. Returning to Temple Beth Israel, it was originally an Orthodox congregation founded by immigrants from Germany. In the late 19th century, there was a new and even larger wave of Jewish immigration, this time from Eastern Europe, which led to the formation of many new Orthodox congregations in Hartford. One of these congregations, the Association of Brothers Children of Israel, was organized in 1884. It seems to have split off from another Orthodox congregation, Ados Israel, which was first organized in 1872. In 1897, the Association of Brothers Children of Israel, which for a number of years had used a building on Front Street, began the construction of the new synagogue on Market Street. There was soon a financial shortfall. As the Hartford Courant reported on October 12, 1898, quote, "The building of the new synagogue was commenced last November by the Congregation Children of Israel. About a month's work was put on it when the second payment came due. They didn't have the needed money, and it was decided to stop building until the money could be raised. A short time ago, the Association Ados Israel, which held services at the corner of Main and Pratt Streets over C.S. Hills and Company's store, united with the Congregation Children of Israel, making it the largest congregation in the state. Ados Israel had a good deal of money, and added to the little money the Children of Israel had succeeded in accumulating, there was enough to meet the second payment, which had already been due for about 9 months. DeSopo Brothers are the builders, and M. O'Donoghue is the architect. O'Neill and Welsh are doing the mason work of the building." Unquote. The United Congregation completed the synagogue on Market Street, a substantial structure that symbolized the growing prominence of the Eastern European Orthodox Jewish community. The synagogue had an impressive interior with a great barrel-vaulted ceiling. There was seating for men on the first floor, while women sat in the galleries. After the building was sold for redevelopment, the congregation moved into a building on Pearl Street that had been erected in 1924 as the Unitarian Meeting House. When it closed in 1986, it was the last synagogue in the city of Hartford. This picture shows highway construction underway in the 1960s. Zooming in, Ados Israel was still there, but soon to be demolished. Near Ados Israel, on the corner of Market Street and Morgan Street, was a building erected in 1884 for the Union for Homework, a charitable organization begun in 1872 by several Hartford women, including Mrs. Elizabeth Colt. It was dedicated to, quote, "the relief of all kinds of suffering and the physical, intellectual, and spiritual elevation of the women and children of our city," unquote. Its initial services included a reading room for girls, a daycare to aid working women, and a coffee house that served hot meals. The organization's educational mission would grow to include a sewing school, various evening schools, and a trade school. As the Hartford Courant described on April 30th, 1884, there was also, quote, a friendly visitors' club composed of ladies who regularly visit the poor, read to them, become familiar with their circumstances, and assist in finding homes for children or in procuring work, and sometimes contribute to their immediate necessities, unquote. There was also a fresh air fund that provided summer vacations in the country for urban children. In 1939, the Union for Homework merged with a similar organization serving the city's east side called the Hartford Social Settlement. Together they formed the Union Settlement of Hartford. By the 1950s, though, there were far fewer children in the neighborhood. Attendance at the Union Settlement's programs had greatly fallen, and redevelopment was looming. In 1956, the Union Settlement merged with the North End Community Center to form Hartford Neighborhood Centers, which still exists on Lawrence Street. The building on Market Street closed its doors in 1959 and was soon torn down. In this photograph, Ados Israel Synagogue is on the right and the Union Settlement is on the left. The pylon for the future highway symbolizes the change coming to the neighborhood. And here is the same area today. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button. Also, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you.